These days, no one questions that the state of Israel is one of the world's top military powers. However, some data might make us see things from a different perspective. Israel covers just 22,145 square kilometers, roughly the size of El Salvador or Slovenia, and it has only 273 kilometers of coastline, about the same as Romania or Montenegro. Of course, sometimes size doesn't matter when it comes to power and wealth. Qatar, for example, is even smaller, yet no one doubts its riches. But here's the difference. Qatar has massive energy reserves, and Israel? None at all. Israel's proven oil reserves are comparable to those of Lithuania or the Czech Republic. Israel doesn't rank in the global top 10 for any major natural resource, neither in reserves nor production. And yet, it has become one of the most powerful nations on the planet. A nation that, right now, is on the verge of redrawing the entire map of the Middle East, practically forging a whole new geopolitical balance.
We have no choice. We are operating against an imminent and existential threat. This operation is for our right to exist here, for our future and for our children's future. The State of Israel has the right and the obligation to operate in order to protect its people and will continue to do so.
For Israel, war isn't the exception. It's the constant backdrop where the very survival of the state is always at stake. Since gaining independence in 1948, Israel has secured military victories against Egypt, Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, Jordan, Iran, and numerous terrorist organizations that have tried to wipe it off the map. We're talking about nearly 8 decades of victories and military advancements that have turned Israel into a global military powerhouse. How was this possible? How did Israel rise to become a top-tier military power? What strategies have allowed it to dominate the Middle East? Well, that's exactly what we're going to break down in this video. Israel's military reputation is unquestionable. However, what many people think they know about its military power is, ironically, often the least relevant part. In fact, before we dive into its military capabilities, let's debunk a few key myths about the Israeli armed forces, starting with its supposed total dependence on the United States. Yes, Washington is Israel's #1 ally, and much of that relationship revolves around military aid, but that doesn't fully explain Israel's military strength. Israel is, without a doubt, the largest historical recipient of US military aid, but if we look at the full ranking, the numbers tell a different story. Afghanistan and South Vietnam also received billions in support from Washington, and we all know how that turned out. Collapsed governments and millions of citizens left to their fate. In other words, while receiving Uncle Sam's dollars certainly helps, it's far from enough. If it were, Afghanistan could have built a strong army to defend itself against the Taliban, and today there wouldn't be Afghan citizens living as hostages in Kabul. And that brings us to debunk the second myth. So, Israel must be spending enormous amounts on its military. Again, false. Here comes another surprise. Israel's military spending isn't even remotely comparable to that of the Security Council countries. Instead, it's more on par with what you'd expect from second-tier nations in terms of defense budgets. Just months before the October 7th, 2023 attacks, Israel's military spending was similar to, or even lower than, that of Canada, Australia, South Korea, or Brazil. And would anyone call Brazil or Australia military superpowers? Of course not. The fact that Israel's military power doesn't strictly depend on its alliance with the United States, nor on the sheer size of its defense budget, points to a different conclusion. The key lies in how Israel manages and develops its armed forces. In other words, how it squeezes the absolute maximum out of every dollar invested in defense. That's the first pillar of the Israeli model. And do you know what's most fascinating? This model existed even before Israel officially became a state. Pay attention. What we see today as a lethal, cutting-edge military force actually started as a completely disorganized guerrilla brigade. You see, in 1948, when Israel declared its independence, 2 types of military forces coexisted in the country. On one hand, there were the Jewish brigades that had served in the British Army and fought in World War II. On the other hand, there were paramilitary organizations like Irgun and Haganah, made up of Jews fighting for independence. Later, once the State of Israel was officially founded, these groups decided to merge and create a professional, organized armed force. The problem? It was basically like mixing apples and oranges. Each group had its own doctrines, training, and chains of command. Everything indicated what could have become a failed experiment, ending in a patchwork of fragmented militias. But just hours after Israel declared independence, Egyptian, Iraqi, Lebanese, Syrian, and Jordanian troops invaded Israeli territory. The entire region came crashing down on them. And yet, against all odds, this triggered a kind of butterfly effect that actually worked in Israel's favor. The various militias quickly united under a single centralized command, answering only to one leader, the Jewish state. The result? After a year and a half of resistance, the Israelis prevailed, and eventually, all these defenders were unified into the Israel Defense Forces, IDF, with one clear founding mission: unify the country to confront hostile Arab states. In other words, Israel didn't have to endure a civil war or political debates over how to build its armed forces. From day one, every military group understood the urgent need to reform a national army, while politicians and society accepted the economic and fiscal sacrifice that came with being heavily armed. Beyond this founding movement, the common experience shared by Israeli fighters became crucial to reshaping their military doctrines. Why? Because both the Jewish brigades and the paramilitary militias had served the Allied forces in places like Africa during the Second World War. There, they gained crucial military experience, learning to fight both low-intensity and high-intensity warfare. But of course, things wouldn't stay that simple for long. Even though the IDF emerged with a significant amount of prior combat experience, Israel faced a very complicated geographical vulnerability. With barely 22,000 square kilometers, Israel was simply too small compared to historical rivals like Egypt or Iraq. So, how could such a tiny country defend itself against giants? The answer lay in a doctrine of preemptive strikes. But what does that actually mean? It means the armed forces were equipped and trained to launch incursions into enemy territory at the very outset of any conflict. In other words, defending itself by going on the offensive. In a neighborhood where size and resources typically dictate the rules of the game, Israel bet its survival on a strategy built around innovation, anticipation, and deterrence. A perfect example of this was the Six-Day War in 1967, when Israel launched a preemptive strike against Egypt, Syria, and Jordan. And even today, well, just look at what's happening with Iran. Nevertheless, while this strategy made sense geographically and politically, it quickly led to numerous diplomatic problems for Israel. The idea of preemptive strikes, like the one the IDF launched against Iran just days ago, created the perception that Israel was an aggressor, not a defender. This started to complicate military procurement at a time when virtually all of Israel's weaponry came from foreign suppliers. For example, in the 1960s, as Israel was negotiating the purchase of dozens of Dassault Mirage 3 fighter jets from France, President Charles de Gaulle imposed an arms embargo that cancelled this and many other contracts. So what did the Israelis do in response? They realized they simply couldn't keep depending on other countries to maintain their arsenal. Ironically, Charles de Gaulle unknowingly paved the way for the birth of one of the world's largest and most advanced defense industries. Israel got to work building its own fighter jets. But there was a problem. Its pilots were already trained and fully accustomed to flying French aircraft, which made it extremely difficult to start everything from scratch. That's when the miracle of reverse engineering came into play. Just take a look at these two aircraft. Can you spot 10 differences between the two? We can't, because there really aren't any. Israeli engineers managed to build their own Dassault Mirage 3 fighters, rebranding them as the Nesher, because, well, you have to respect other people's intellectual property. Sort of. These aircraft became the spearhead of Israel's Air Force throughout the 1960s and 1970s. The official Israeli version tells the story of a successful reverse engineering process, where simply having the Mirage 3 allowed them to replicate its production. However, some sources suggest stolen blueprints by Israeli intelligence, or even possible complicity from the French authorities. The Nesher fighter became the cornerstone of an emerging military industry that would soon turn Israel into a true defense powerhouse. At the same time, Israel started developing its own line of armored vehicles, drawing inspiration from the American Abrams and the German Leopard tanks. This led to the Merkava, one of the most advanced tanks in the world, which began leading Israeli armored divisions in 1979. And it wasn't just about building at home, it was also about securing domestic supply chains. To give you an idea, more than 90% of these Steel Dragons components are manufactured by local companies. The Israelis went on to design and produce their own assault rifles, like the Galil, and submachine guns like the Uzi. And let's not forget the missile industry, which ultimately led to the creation of the Iron Dome, the most powerful missile defense system in the world. By the 21st century, Israel had achieved full self-sufficiency in defense manufacturing, producing nearly everything required to sustain its critical firepower. And here's the key. This isn't just gear for its own military. We're talking about cutting-edge defense technology that's in demand around the world.
It's estimated that between 1967 and 1970, Israel's defense industry quadrupled its output. By 1972, it was already employing around 20,000 people. Even during the inflation crisis that hit Israel in those years, when many sectors faced mass layoffs, the defense industry maintained its productivity without cuts.
And yes, I know exactly what you're thinking, but wait, Israel's arsenal is full of American weapons and fighter jets, so they can't be that self-sufficient, right? Well, yes, but not quite. This is where we need to dig a little deeper, because Israeli military engineers are famously and relentlessly creative. In fact, Israel is one of the few countries that negotiates free intervention contracts with American suppliers. Now, what does that mean? Essentially, a license to modify and produce. To this day, Israel continues to develop its own customized models based on foreign deliveries. Want an example? Let's take a look at the F-16 Fighting Falcon. Israel has operated a fleet of nearly 400 F-16s since 1980. But Israeli F-16s aren't exactly standard. As soon as they arrive at Israeli air bases, they immediately undergo a full retrofitting process. There, Israeli engineers install their own interfaces, radars, missiles, mission software. They even modify parts of the fuselage itself. The Israeli F-16 fleet includes models such as Netz, Barak, and Sufa, a variant of the original jet exclusively available to the IDF, although these are now being gradually replaced by the newer F-35s. Israel quickly leveraged this military cluster to integrate private companies during the economic liberalization of the 1990s. Local firms like Elbit Systems Limited, Israel Aerospace Industries, and Rafael Advanced Defense Systems now control huge shares of the global defense market, producing systems widely regarded as unmatched in lethality and precision. If we exclude the United States, Israel ranks as the world's 6th largest exporter of heavy weaponry. And we're talking about a country roughly the size of New Jersey, with a population similar to that of Honduras. All this means that Israel's military spending isn't a heavy burden on public finances, quite the opposite. It's fully integrated into the national economy, generating jobs and contributing positively to tax revenues, and therefore to the government's overall budget. However, there's still one final pillar behind Israel's fearsome military power that remains largely in the shadows: intelligence. In September last year, thousands of pagers and walkie-talkies suddenly began exploding across Lebanon. Mossad had tampered with nearly 16,000 communication devices, which were then sold to Hezbollah through a front company. When it comes to intelligence, Mossad has proven to be one of the most precise and successful agencies in the world, capable of causing enormous damage at a very low cost. And we've seen this again in the recent offensive with Iran. Mossad managed to neutralize multiple air defense systems through infiltration and sabotage operations. Around 200 Israeli fighter jets took off, struck, and returned home safely, thanks to agents and a handful of drones operating deep inside Iranian territory. The best part? Its annual budget barely reaches $3 billion. And yet, Mossad is the second largest intelligence agency in the West, after the CIA. Think of it like this. With intelligence, you strike better. If you strike better, you need fewer resources, and therefore you can achieve much more with less money. In other words, Mossad is one of Israel's most efficient cost savers in defense spending. But information isn't just a tool for the battlefield, it also exerts a heavy psychological toll on the enemy. Throughout the 20th century, Israel tracked down and captured or eliminated numerous Nazi leaders hiding in Europe or living undercover in Argentina. This established a very clear message: no declared enemy of the Jewish people would ever be safe, even if protected by layers of security in some exclusive neighborhood of Tehran. That's how deep and lethal Israeli intelligence has become, to the point where Netanyahu and Trump can afford to have conversations like this.
Netanyahu does not rule out assassinating Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei. We will do whatever is necessary. Donald Trump vetoed a previous Israeli plan to assassinate the Shiite cleric, according to several media outlets.
In other words, Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and US President Donald Trump are publicly discussing whether they should take out Iran's supreme leader. And it's not like they're weighing the options or evaluating how it might be done. No, they're absolutely certain that with just one phone call, the head of the state of a rival country could be eliminated within minutes. Now, What kind of impact does that level of power have on the battlefield? Just imagine the mindset of Iranian generals, or the leadership of any enemy nation, working under that kind of constant pressure. That said, Israel's neighborhood problems, particularly the ones rooted in religion, may have also worked in its favor. And this is crucial for understanding Israel's very specific advantage over Iran in the current conflict. Pay attention.
A faith fit for battle.
A large part of the conflicts in the Middle East are driven by religious wars, where one faction of the Muslim faith seeks to wipe out both Jews and Christians. The issue, as many experts point out, is that most Arab nations share one common flaw. They fail to draw a clear line between religion and the military. And you might say, well, doesn't the IDF clearly have a Jewish bias that could also hurt them? Well, yes and no. It's true that senior positions in the military and intelligence services are reserved for Jewish citizens, but Christians and even Muslims also serve in the Israeli armed forces. The real issue isn't the composition of the troops, but how religion influences the chain of command and the design of military strategy, especially in Iran. Iran's military power is completely fragmented into several separate armed corps, often disconnected from one another. On one hand, you have Iran's conventional armed forces, the army, air force, and navy, but they respond more directly to the head of government than to the supreme leader. Then you have groups like the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, which operate under strict religious control from the regime. The IRGC even has its own intelligence units and its own missile program operating independently from the air force or other branches of the military. On top of that, there are jihadist militia groups like Hezbollah and Hamas, which also operate with resources and supplies provided by Iran, although both are currently significantly weakened. All of this leads to scattered resources, investments, training, and strategies, highly fragmented and disorganized. The Iranian military structure was once seen as a true web of terror against Israel's interests. In a way, Israel had to prepare for a wide range of threats, from terrorist attacks in Gaza to open warfare in Lebanon. However, this multi-pronged threat has now turned into a boomerang. Today, creating chaos and disorganization within Iran's own ranks has become one of Israel's most effective military strategies. And beyond Iran's organizational problems as a theocracy, we also need to factor in the multiple economic crises that have hit Israel's potential rivals. After all, authoritarianism and lack of economic freedom have long been common features in many Middle Eastern countries. In contrast, Israel's stable rule of law, combined with an active promotion of private investment, has allowed the Jewish state to build one of the most enviable military departments in the entire region. Israel maintains defense spending far higher than that of countries it has faced in past wars, countries that were not only defeated on the battlefield, but that also ended up with economies deeply lagging behind Israel's remarkable economic takeoff. These two factors, though not strictly military, have played a decisive role in making Israel an undeniable military powerhouse. The country has built the economic and financial foundations necessary to sustain its military might. At the same time, its cultural and religious context has allowed for the organization of a highly professional and cohesive armed force. The combination of all these elements has produced a formula that is as unique as it is effective for forging a true military power. And in a way, all of these factors are now visible in the current offensive against Iran. Israel's strategic superiority and the efficiency of its missile capabilities, both offensive and defensive, are the result of a highly professionalized military force supported by a cutting-edge defense industry. Damage reports from Iran shows hits on energy, military, and even political targets, proving that Israeli intelligence knows every corner of Tehran with near surgical precision. Israel's history and its current performance demonstrate that building military power isn't just about massive budgets or having powerful allies, but about strategic vision, social cohesion, and technological capabilities. And now, it's your turn. What other factors do you think have made Israel a true military power? What lessons can be learned from this case for South Korea, Taiwan, or Ukraine, which also face existential threats? Is there any country in the Middle East that could match Israel's military level? Who could achieve this, and what would they need in order to do so? Leave us your opinions below in the comments, and we'll launch a debate. And very important, if you liked this video, please click the like button and subscribe to Visualeconomik if you haven't done so already. All the best. See you next time.